So we have the situation in our cultures that pits models of God against models from science. And there's all kinds of argument. Apparently people think that these two ways of knowing, the religious and the scientific, are supposed to get along. Or even that they're really talking about the same thing. I don't think they are. I think they're two very different ways of coming at questions about identity and meaning and origin. But the problem that we have is really strange, because most of what goes on in our culture under the rubric, under the label of God worship and religion, is actually pretty weird and doesn't look like what it should look like if it were what it says it is. And then sort of in the other corner, we've got science. Or rather, we have the produce of research and the things that various people say about what this might mean, imply, deny, and so on. So, the really weird thing though is, let's look at each position carefully for a moment. When we ask someone, do they believe in God or not, or when we hear this question asked, especially in public, it actually doesn't mean what it can mean one of a wide variety of very different things. And often what it means is something like, have you selected one of the off-the-shelf models of God and become cognitively, behaviorally, imaginally, and relationally compliant with its proclamations? Now, that's a pretty weird thing to suggest, because we're not actually asking about God, we're kind of asking about an off-the-shelf product of human culture. We're not asking about whether God exists or whether you think God might exist, but rather, what's your relationship with the specific models of God that are on sale in culture and literature? This is a really strange idea. And then on the other, sort of in the same problem, we have people who say they don't believe in God, or they don't know, or they believe there is no such thing as God. But again, they're not talking about the same thing, right? Or actually we have the same problem. We have them reacting to the off-the-shelf models, common ideas, arguments, and positions, opinions, really. And so the question of what God might refer to, for example, what it would be like to have an actual relationship with God or discover personally what this is all about, is sidetracked into, do you believe this model or that model, the Christian model, the Buddhist, the Islamic, the occultist, and so on? Which one of these camps do you belong to? And so the people who say they don't believe in God I'm not really sure they've ever examined the question. What they know is that they don't belong to those camps. And that's a reasonable thing to know, even for people who, shall we say, in clumsy language, believe in God. So there's another really weird thing, which is that there are all these people with books about exactly what it is to mean and be and become in language, in writing, and often in very poor translation, that are supposed to be the divine edicts of God. Well, that's kind of weird, because just imagine with me a metaphoric situation. Imagine that it's imperative that you establish a true and sincere, heartful and spiritual relationship with a woman. And instead of doing that with an actual woman, right, what you do is you adopt this book that was written supposedly by the woman of all women a long time ago, and the book tells you everything in in a very strange way. It tells you everything you're supposed to be and do and think and know and become about women. Notice that that would have nothing to do with having an actual relationship with your girlfriend, or your boyfriend if you're a woman, or your girlfriend if you're a girl who likes girls, and your boyfriend if you're a boy who likes boys. So it would have nothing to do with that. It would be a completely different thing. And I think we can all see that it's impossible to write a book about relating with humans, especially in such a short volume, or nature, right? And so if it's impossible to write a book about relating with humans or nature or consciousness, for example, then it must be impossible to write a book about relating with the possibility of there being minds or consciousnesses or books or humans or gods, right? There's no way that the book could leap up above both humanity, imagination, consciousness, and everything, even really above God, and just declare down to us what all these things are in static language. Can't happen. They're two different orders of reality. One's description and one's relation, right? So we've confused description and complying with descriptions with relations. And if we were actually having relations of any kind, the descriptions would not be very compelling. And I bet the atheists secretly sense this, right? Even if they wouldn't articulate it precisely this way, they can tell the difference between someone attempting to convert them to a subculture and whatever it might mean that there's the possibility of divinity in reality. So the people of the religions are really pretty confused. I doubt in general they actually know anything about God or much about God, because they're relating with representations, which is really weirdly the explicit prohibition of like at least one of these books. I mean, so it's really strange. We have a problem with representations. We argue about them all the time. And you know, science over on the other hand, let's talk about that position for a minute. It's really important to understand a few things about science. First of all, it's a way of knowing. Secondly, there's no such thing as science. It doesn't exist. Science, like religion, is what people write and think and do and say that is in accord with the principles that would allow us to call such activity scientific, right? So there's no real such thing as science, and religion is the same thing, right? It isn't God or even knowing God. It's what people do and think and say and write and tell each other and punish each other for and kill each other over, that's supposed to be about that. So anyway, what I'm getting at is science never tells us what things are or what things aren't. Although the latter, I'll put an asterisk there. It can tell us very specific things about parts and how these parts relate under certain circumstances. We can learn a great deal from science. It's a fascinating way of knowing. There's everything amazing about it. And it's fascinated me since childhood. Whereas religion, on the other hand, was pretty peculiar until I got some kind of experience about what was underneath the stories. In any case, the thing I want to get at about science is twofold. Science is always busy negating itself, so it progresses kind of by self-negation. That's a really strange thing. It's not like what common people think. They think of science as an authority that verifies things. Science has proved something. This is often really sloppy language. There are cases where it's accurate, of course. But what science is really in the quote-unquote business of is discovery. And discovery involves a battle of sorts where ideas attack each other, and even the people who you would think would be the champions of an idea have to attack it fiercely just to ensure that they're getting anywhere. It's a very rigorous, almost pseudo-mechanical method of gathering reputable information and data about relationships and entities in time and biology and chemistry and so on. So it doesn't tell us what things are. And like any discipline, it has to invent language for the things that its methods distinguish, right? And constellate in relation. I think the other thing, forgive me if I've lost my train of thought a bit here, about science that's very, oh yes, here it is. So I often hear from people who categorize themselves as atheists, when asked, why don't you believe in God? Or, for example, why aren't you at least agnostic? Why don't you admit the possibility of God? They'll often say, well, there's no evidence of anything like that, and none would be required for what we presently understand about blah, 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 right? Well, unfortunately, the same was true of quantum mechanics. Now, of course, later, when we, kind of got the whiff of what was going on, we probably could, and I think we have, developed some tests that in the macro world would hint at least at the existence of quantum mechanical phenomenon. In fact, perhaps the macro world already hints, but we didn't know how to look at it. So there was no evidence of quantum mechanics prior to its discovery either. Does that mean we shouldn't believe in it? Well, it's a set of theories and descriptions that are coherent with reality. We don't have to believe in them. We can either notice that they're coherent or not. It's not really a matter of faith. But it's really weird if you have the religious version of theories, because there's no way to tell if they're coherent with reality at all. Which is why theories about religion, i.e. books and structured, traditions and da-da-da-da, are actually incredibly dangerous. Because those theories and the people and collectives that hold them are hungry for the same kind of relatively dependable authority that the proclamations of science have. So there's kind of a weird and dangerous competition here. And then you get, of course, them spinning theories like in, the religious people, quote unquote, the people of the stories about religion anyway, start spinning theories like intelligent design and this and that. Honestly, the whole idea of whatever the word God refers to as a human architect who planned something and then implemented it seems a little unlikely to me. In fact, I'm guessing that, just forgive me for being bold here, but whatever it is that this word God might refer to, it's completely beyond all of the classes of our language. And any exposure to this directly in consciousness would probably be nearly fatal or cause you to go insane. And probably the people who were did go insane. And so there's lots of conflicts with the idea that you're going to talk about this pointer, we'll call it, God, in ordinary common language or even in elaborate biblical language and get anywhere near the phenomenon. No, it's going to be fraught with danger, and talking about it isn't like being with it. There are everyday instances of actual human beauty in action, in caring and seeing with and for each other together, instantaneously, randomly in the street. These happen, that are fundamentally messianic. But all of the people in the books are talking about, like, one guy will come, and they also kind of think he's a guy. One guy will come and be the Messiah. Really? I don't know. Forgive me, but it sounds like a fable. It also, if we notice that there's this difference between talking about things and becoming them, just like there is in talking about relationships and aping them out in rituals and stuff, instead of actually having them, we might have a concern that we could be on the wrong track there. That the Messiah who might come is either right here, right now, with us together as each, with and for each other, or just me, or just you, or our one child, in a moment, where if we would recognize the profound beauty and urgent humanity and actual palpable divinity of what is present, all of the arguments would disappear. In fact, you really only need all those arguments when you're not having those experiences and becoming them together. That's where the theories come from, the absence of being whatever it is and discovering whatever it is that is, referred to in all of these theories. So, the agnostic position is relatively reasonable. And it seems to me that the people who don't believe in God have, usually what they mean is they don't believe in the 4 or 5 models they've encountered and all the insane things that happen around those, which seems reasonable to me. I don't know if they've really examined, what does that mean, God? And if they did, they'd probably find, well, it leads outside of language and models. In the first move, it goes, boom, right outside. So, wow. What would it be to think or understand or learn something about this? It's worth discovering, right? The questions should be totally valid for everybody, because science can't place the question of God off the table, but it's reasonably fond of jousting with ridiculous models of divinity, right? And most scientists have a sense that there's something behind the order and structure and beauty and profound infinite depth of nature that they're engaged in opening to thought and consideration and exploration. They know. The ones that don't have probably become confused. But they're not going to use this G word, for sure, right? In general, in almost every case, that word refers to some very specific subculture things, models that they think, like probably most people should, don't make a lot of sense, and probably are the remnants of something we don't quite understand that may have to do with the topic, but certainly do not preside over it, right? So the most confused people in some ways are the actually religious people, because many of them are living inside a model that's very constrictive and almost by nature must fail to deliver on all of its promises, and at ever more catastrophic expense. So that's a big mess right there. Somewhere there are people who actually, without maybe even having any, they don't belong to any camp, they don't care to call themselves atheists or believers or anything, but are directly engaged in either the relationship with the divine or the questions. And that's really where we want to be, right? And we don't belong to any group in that position. We're not believers, we're not atheists, we're not scientists, we're not agnostic. We're human. And we have the authorial precedence for our own understanding and learning and discovery and experience. It does not sit with dead voices in books or eloquent theorems in research. It's in us, as us, here. We are the living questions, right? We're not shoppers at the table of pre-authored answers. For both science and religion, this position fails. And every scientist and every mystic knows this. We must become the authors of the question and the living answers of its possibilities. Jousting over opinions really seems like, we're doing something else. And I think if we could notice the distinction between the people who have the stories and the people who say those stories are silly, the actual questions and the actual promise of science, the seeming conflict would dissolve. And mysticism would remain mysticism, science would remain science, but most of the infighting and battles and killing and confusion would just disappear. Wouldn't that be interesting?